John knelt on the cold floor, his knees aching as they hit the hard stone floor. His trembling hands clutched the hem of the woman's dress in front of him. His lips moved, but no words came out immediately. Hot tears welled up in his eyes, rolling down his pale cheeks in despair. At that moment, his self-esteem was shattered. Never had this 35-year-old man thought that one day he would have to kneel before anyone, let alone a woman he once despised. John's voice was hoarse, both ashamed and painful. "I beg you, save my wife. Please." He raised his tear-stained face, looking desperately at the woman standing before him. It was Grace, a 40-year-old American woman, her cold eyes looking down at the man kneeling at her feet. In those eyes, there was shock mixed with suppressed anger. She never thought she would see this. John, the white man known for his pride, now on his knees begging her. Sorry for interrupting the story. Dear friends, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and click the notification bell to receive the latest videos. In the stifling silence of the room, only John's sobs and gasps could be heard. His heart was pounding in his chest. His pride was being torn apart. With each passing second, the hope of saving his beloved wife's life was fading if he didn't receive a nod from Grace. John bowed his head, his voice choked. "I know, I have no right to beg you, but without you, my wife will be in danger. Please help her. I'm willing to do anything. Just save her." The man's broad shoulders trembled. He had never felt so small and helpless. The pride he once cherished the most was now nothing more than a meaningless luxury when his wife's life was hanging by a thread. John closed his eyes tightly, two streams of hot tears flowing down. He waited in fear, waiting for the verdict from the only woman who could save his wife's life. Just hours earlier, John had been fidgeting outside the operating room where his wife, Mary, was undergoing emergency surgery. His hands were clenched so tightly that they turned white on the plastic chair, his eyes glued to the operating room door with the red light still on. John's heart felt like it was about to explode with worry. Every time he thought of Mary lying motionless on the operating table, his heart ached. He couldn't lose her. Mary was his whole world, his gentle wife, who had been by his side for the past 10 years, who had given him unconditional love and trust. The thought of a life without Mary made John feel as if the ground beneath his feet had collapsed. This morning, Mary had collapsed at home from a brain aneurysm that they had not known about. When John rushed his wife to the hospital, she was in critical condition, needing emergency surgery to stop the bleeding in her brain. The emergency room doctor had alerted the entire hospital to find the best surgeon who could perform this difficult surgery. And then Grace showed up. She was a brilliant neurosurgeon who happened to be at the hospital that day assisting with another case. In the heat of the moment, Grace volunteered to take over Mary's surgery. John recalled the moment he met Grace before the surgery. She was dressed in a blue surgical gown, her face showing concentration and urgency. A nurse briefly introduced her as a leading expert in the field of neurosurgery, having saved many critically ill patients. But at that time, John only glanced at her and frowned. He was surprised that the talented doctor they were talking about was a young black woman. In a moment of unconscious prejudice, John found it hard to believe. He was used to seeing the chief surgeons as older, white men with gray hair full of experience. But Grace was so different from what he had imagined. Facing John's hesitant gaze, Grace calmly explained the situation. "Your wife's condition is critical. We need immediate surgery to relieve pressure on the brain and patch the ruptured blood vessel. I will be the one to perform this surgery. Rest assured, my team and I will do our best." Her voice was deep, strong, and exuded confidence. But John, in his panic and extreme concern for his wife, was blinded by pride and prejudice. He hesitated. "You are the main doctor? Is there no one else?" That question blurted out with doubt, causing Grace's eyes to suddenly turn cold. A hint of disappointment appeared in her eyes. However, Grace calmly replied, "I understand that you are very worried about your wife, but I guarantee that I am capable of saving her. Please trust us." John noticed the hurt pride flash across Grace's face, but he still hesitated. The thought flashed through his mind to call another doctor he knew at a big hospital in the city, someone he trusted more. Time was precious, but John hesitated in a conflict. On one side was the responsible suggestion of Grace, the only person willing to operate immediately to save Mary. On the other side was a vague fear and prejudice that he himself did not understand why he had. In the end, pride mixed with doubt made John make the wrong decision. He asked the hospital to contact his familiar doctor. Grace looked at him, stunned. "Are you sure? We don't have much time." John clenched his teeth, nodded, and avoided Grace's gaze. He insisted on waiting for another doctor. In his heart, he thought he was doing the best for his wife, that choosing a doctor he knew would be more reassuring. But he didn't realize that his decision stemmed from an unreasonable lack of trust in Grace. Grace pursed her lips. She shook her head slightly, exchanged a quick word with her colleagues, and then stepped back. Before leaving, she looked straight into John's eyes and said briefly, "I sincerely hope your wife is well." Her voice was cold, filled with sadness and disappointment. John could not forget the look in Grace's eyes at that moment, a look of hurt mixed with reproach that made his heart ache slightly, even though he tried to ignore it. The surgery was then performed by the doctor John trusted. He arrived later than expected because of traffic, and by the time he started the surgery, Mary's condition had deteriorated significantly. John sat outside, his heart burning, but he still reassured himself that he had done the right thing, that his wife was in the hands of someone he trusted. However, cruel fate did not give him the chance to correct his mistake. The door to the operating room opened. The doctor walked out with a tired and worried face. John's heart sank. He took off his mask, shook his head. "We tried, but the hematoma was too big, I'm afraid." The next words fell apart in John's ears. He leaned against the wall, stunned, as the doctor explained that Mary was still in a deep coma. Her condition was critical, and they had done everything they could. Perhaps only a miracle could save her. "No, it can't be," John muttered, his mind spinning. The doctor sadly placed his hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry. If possible, you should prepare yourself." Then he quietly left, leaving John numb in the cold hallway. His world seemed to collapse at that moment. Mary could die. No, he couldn't accept that. In his extreme despair, a name flashed through John's mind: Grace. The doctor who had volunteered to help Mary as soon as she was admitted to the hospital. The person he had coldly dismissed. John remembered the confidence in Grace's eyes when she said she would save his wife. She was there, ready, and yet he had refused her help. Regret and self-reproach squeezed John's chest. For the first time in his life, he felt hatred for his own blind pride. If he hadn't let his prejudice overwhelm him, perhaps Mary would have been out of danger by now. John scratched his head, hot tears welling up. No, he couldn't sit here and cry. Mary was still breathing. She was still fighting. He had to do something. He had to find a way to save her, even if the chance was slim. John almost rushed to the reception desk, his voice urgent and desperate as he asked about Grace's whereabouts. A nurse said that after leaving the operating room, Grace had packed up and left the hospital not long after. Perhaps she had returned home. Having received Grace's contact information from the hospital, John immediately rushed to the parking lot, speeding down the road. It was already dark outside. Raindrops began to patter on the windshield, like his rapid heartbeat. John had only one goal in mind: find Grace and beg her to save Mary. Even if he had to beg on his knees, even if it meant risking his dignity, he would accept. The streetlights swept across John's tense face as he dashed through the rain. For the first time, he prayed, fervently, that he wouldn't be too late. Grace took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She spoke, her voice sharp but still calm. "Stand up, John. What are you doing?" Grace had never seen such a scene. She was used to seeing patients' families begging doctors for help. But this one was especially bitter. This proud man who had once dismissed her from the operating room was now on his knees begging her to save his wife. John looked up at Grace, but he didn't dare stand up. The coldness in her voice made his heart clench. He stuttered, "I know I was wrong. I know I don't deserve it. But no one else can save Mary." His voice choked, each word ringing out like a desperate plea. "I'm sorry, Dr. Grace. It was my pride and prejudice that clouded my judgment. I beg you, please have mercy on Mary. She's innocent. Don't punish her for my mistake." Grace closed her eyes, suppressing the emotions that were surging inside her. John's words reminded her of the pain she felt that morning when she was looked down upon. She took a breath, trying to keep her voice cold. "Do you know how I felt when you decided to change doctors, John? I was ready to fight for your wife's life, and yet you looked at me like I was untrustworthy, just because I don't match your image of a good doctor." Grace's eyes were glistening, both angry and hurt. "Do you think a black woman like me can't save your wife?" Her question echoed, piercing John's heart. "No, it's not like that." John shook his head, his voice panicked. "I was stupid and narrow-minded. I was wrong, completely wrong. I didn't dare to justify myself. At that time, I was too scared and stubborn. I didn't trust you." But now he almost burst into tears, his hands still clasped tightly in prayer. "Now I can only rely on you. I beg you, Please save my wife. If I lose Mary, I don't want to live anymore." His voice broke in sobs. Looking at the man with his head bowed before him, Grace couldn't help but feel conflicted. On one hand, she was still extremely angry with him, the righteous anger of her wounded pride. On the other hand, her doctor's heart urged her not to abandon a life in danger. She recalled the moment she saw Mary's CT scan results this morning. A large hematoma pressing on her brain. The situation was dire, but not completely hopeless. At that moment, Grace was determined to save the woman, using all her knowledge and experience. Even though the chance was slim, she still wanted to try. Then John pushed her away, choosing another path. The heartbreaking results she had predicted. Mary did not survive the first surgery. Now, Mary's condition must have been even more critical. Does she still have a chance? John raised his tearful eyes, asking like a drowning man clinging to the last blade of grass. "As long as you do it, I believe she will live. I believe in you, Grace. Please believe in yourself." Grace opened her eyes wide and looked at John. The man in front of her, who had doubted her abilities just a few hours ago, now said he believed in her. Could desperation change people so quickly? She wanted to be angry, wanted to ignore him, but her conscience and compassion did not allow her to turn her back. Even though she was insulted, she was still a doctor. She had sworn to save people, and Mary, the innocent woman lying on the hospital bed, did not deserve to die just because of her husband's stupidity. Grace sighed. Her anger gradually subsided to give way to sympathy. She looked at John, her voice low, serious, but no longer cold as ice. "Okay, I will try one more time. I can't promise anything, because your wife's condition is very bad right now. But I will do everything I can." John looked up in shock, thinking he had misheard. "You agree to save Mary?" he asked again, his voice breaking. Seeing Grace nod slightly, John was so moved that he almost fell to his knees again. He mumbled, "Thank you. I don't know what else to say." "Enough." Grace raised her hand to signal him to stop. She looked at him, her eyes softening but still serious. "Get up. We have to get to the hospital before it's too late." John stood up unsteadily, his legs numb from kneeling for so long that he almost fell. He had to hold onto the door frame to regain his balance. Grace quickly put on her coat and reached for her car keys. Before she stepped out the door, she hesitated and turned back to look at John. "John, I helped your wife not because you deserve my help, but because she deserves to live, and because I am a doctor." Her voice was soft but firm. "Do you understand what I mean?" John lowered his head, feeling shame burning on his face. "Yes, I understand. I am grateful to you, and I am truly sorry." Grace did not reply, just silently turned away. But at least, John knew that she had accepted to save Mary, and that was the most important thing right now. The two people rushed out into the night rain. The cold wind blew against their faces, but John felt nothing but a glimmer of hope that had just been kindled. He opened the car door for Grace, then went around to the driver's seat, stepped on the gas, and sped off to the hospital. Along the way, John glanced at Grace, sitting next to him many times. Her face looked out into the rain, and in the flickering streetlights, he saw the determination return to the doctor's face. She was concentrating on thinking of a way to save Mary, he guessed, because he himself was silently praying for the miracle she was about to perform. At the hospital, Mary was still in a deep coma. The machines around her were making monotonous sounds signaling her fragile state of life. When John and Grace rushed in, the doctors and nurses on duty at night were all stunned. The head doctor on duty came over and exclaimed in surprise, "Dr. Grace, you're back. There's no time to explain. How is Mary?" Grace interrupted, her professional demeanor immediately drawing everyone's attention. The doctor reported quickly. After the previous surgery, Mary was still in a coma, cerebral edema increased, and blood pressure dropped. They had done everything they could to maintain her, but there was no improvement. Grace nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "I'll operate on her again. Prepare the operating room immediately." She turned to John. "Please sign the guarantee again. This time the risk is very high. You have to prepare yourself mentally." John nodded like a machine. "I'm ready. No matter what, we have to try. Please do it." He signed the necessary papers that the nurse gave him with trembling hands, silently praying to all the gods. Before entering the operating room, Grace stopped and looked at John for a moment. Worry was evident in his eyes. She slowly said, "I will do my best. Trust me." This time, John answered without hesitation, "I trust you. I have complete faith in you, Dr. Grace." The operating room door closed in front of John, separating him and his wife once again. Outside, he was left sitting alone on the chair, his heart heavy with hope and fear. The waiting time seemed endless. Every minute that passed, John imagined Mary's face, recalling every memory between them. He remembered her gentle smile, remembered the times she held his hand to encourage him whenever he was in trouble. She always believed in and supported him unconditionally. Yet at the decisive moment of her life or death, he failed to fulfill his duty to protect her. That thought was like a knife piercing his heart, making John constantly blame himself. He bowed his head, mumbling a prayer even though he was not normally a religious person. He could only cling to the fragile belief that grace, the last savior, would bring Mary back from the hands of death. After more than 3 hours, when John was about to collapse from worry, the operating room door suddenly opened. Grace walked out, her face showing signs of fatigue from the fierce battle, sweat still beading on her forehead. John almost held his breath, his eyes glued to Grace's eyes, searching for a glimmer of hope. Grace pulled down her mask. In the moment of silence, she slowly smiled softly. The surgery was successful. Your wife is out of danger. John was silent for a few seconds, then almost burst into tears of joy. He hugged the little doctor in front of him. Thank you, thank you. Thank God. Oh, thank you so much, Grace. His tears fell again, this time tears of happiness. At first, Grace paused in surprise when John hugged her, but then she patted his back and said softly, Okay, your wife needs you. She gently separated from John's arms and smiled, pointing to the hospital bed being pushed out of the operating room. Mary lay there, her face still very weak, but her breathing was more even. The machines also showed signs of survival more stable than before. John ran to the stretcher, holding his wife's cold hand. Mary, honey, he whispered, even though he knew she was still unconscious and couldn't hear. His tears fell onto her hand. The first time that day they were tears of relief. Mary was still here alive. A short time later, Mary was transferred to the recovery room. The attending physician told John that she needed to be monitored, but that she had a good chance of recovery thanks to the successful surgery. John sat by his wife's bedside, his hands never leaving hers. He looked up at Grace, who was standing at the foot of the bed, checking the numbers on the monitor. An indescribable feeling of gratitude welled up inside him. Grace, John said, his voice sincere. I can't thank you enough. You saved my wife, saved my life. Grace made a few notes in the medical record and turned to John. She shook her head slightly. Be thankful that your wife is strong. She is the real fighter. She stepped closer, looking at Mary, who was sleeping soundly. I was just doing my duty. John stood up, looked straight at Grace, his eyes red. No, you did more than your duty. You gave us a second chance. He choked up, then bowed deeply in gratitude. I apologize for everything. I was wrong to not trust you from the beginning. Grace was silent for a few seconds, then gently placed her hand on John's shoulder. I accept your apology. Her voice was unusually warm. I hope you learned something from this too. John looked up and nodded vigorously. Yes, I have learned too much. I understand that my pride almost cost me the life of the person I love the most. I will never, his voice trembled, never judge people by their appearance or prejudice again, and never let blind pride overshadow love. Grace smiled gently. That's good. Your wife needs a loving husband more than a conceited one. The straightforward but sincere words made John's nose sting. He nodded gratefully. Mary opened her eyes weakly the next morning. John happily bent down to kiss his wife's forehead, saying through tears, Honey, thank God you're awake. Mary tiredly smiled a fragile smile. She whispered, You are alive. Yes, I'm saved. John choked. Thanks to Dr. Grace. She saved me. He looked towards the end of the bed. Mary slowly followed his gaze. Grace was standing there, her eyes gentle behind her glasses. Mary recognized her, her voice weak. You are the doctor who was there when I fainted, right? Grace nodded, gently holding Mary's hand with the 4-needle in it. Yes. Brother John brought me to the hospital in time. I was very strong. Mary pursed her lips, the corners of her eyes wet with tears. Thank you. If it weren't for you, she choked up. Grace shook her head slightly. You should rest. Everything's fine. Mary gently squeezed Grace's hand in gratitude, and then let go. She turned to John, her eyes bewildered as if she wanted to ask something. John smiled through his tears, whispering, I'll tell you later. You need to rest now. I'm here, not going anywhere. Mary closed her eyes in peace, her hand still in John's. Grace stepped back, silently leaving the room to give the couple some privacy. Before leaving, she caught John's eyes following her. The two looked at each other, without saying another word but understanding each other's feelings. John sent her a look filled with gratitude and respect. Grace nodded slightly in response, smiled, and gently closed the door. In the quiet hospital room, John sat by the bed, looking at his wife's familiar face. She had returned to him, lying there peacefully. His fingers gently stroked Mary's soft hair, his heart filled with deep happiness and bitter regret. He recalled everything that had happened today, from the terrifying moment when Mary collapsed, to the wrong decision because of his own blind pride, to the moment he had to kneel down and beg for help from the woman he had disrespected. It was all like a terrible nightmare, but fortunately Mary was saved in the end. John realized he had learned a valuable lesson, that his love for his wife was the most precious thing, worth trading everything for, including his own self-respect. Self-respect is important, but if misplaced and at the wrong time, it can become a wall that prevents him from reaching good things. It was his senseless pride that almost took Mary's life and his happiness. In the misty dawn outside the window, John bent down to hold his wife's hand tightly, whispering an apology even though he knew she was sleeping. "I'm sorry, Mary. I was not sober, but I promise to make it up to you for the rest of my life." A tear rolled down his cheek, sparkling in the dim light. It was a tear of regret and gratitude. He also silently thanked Grace, the strange woman whom he now respected so much. She had forgiven him for his mistakes and used her talent and heart to bring about miracles. If it weren't for Grace, he would have lost his beloved wife by now. Her forgiveness and kindness moved John to the core. John raised his head to look out the window, where the sky, after the rain, was brightening. The first rays of dawn were rising, gently dispelling the darkness of the past night. For John, this dawn had a new meaning. He understood that from today, his life had changed. He promised himself to live differently, to live more humbly, more tolerantly, to cherish the people around him more, and especially to cherish his beloved wife. John's story ended with the image of a man silently bowing his head by the hospital bed, his hands clasped tightly with his wife's. It was not a bow of defeat, but of love and awakening. Through love, he found the most precious thing in his life, and through forgiveness, a woman saved everything. Sometimes, in life, self-esteem and ego can make us lose important things. It takes a lot of courage for a person to kneel down, give up his own pride for the happiness of the person he loves. But it is that humility and sincere love that create true strength. John's story reminds us that self-esteem is precious, but love and compassion are much more precious. Knowing how to bow down when necessary is not cowardice, but to cherish what we love. And forgiveness has magical power. It can dissolve hatred, heal wounds, and even save a life. If you like this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and click the notification bell to support and watch more interesting stories on our channel. If you want me to do any topic, please comment below. See you in the next video. Have a great day.